August 1943. The air above Salerno shimmered in the late summer heat, a thin blue haze that softened the horizon but hid danger within it. Oberleutnant Heinrich Bar, one of the Luftwaffe's most confident aces, banked his Messerschmitt toward a glint of metal below, something large, strange and slow. Two engines, a wide twin boom tail, a design so ungainly he almost laughed. The Americans, he thought, must be desperate. Yet in the next instant, that strange aircraft pulled into a climb so sharp it left his instruments rattling. The P-38 Lightning. Its twin Allisons roared in perfect harmony, propellers a blur of power and precision. Before Bar could react, tracers streaked past his canopy, converging with mathematical accuracy. He dove away, heart pounding, suddenly aware that what he'd mocked moments ago was a machine unlike any he'd faced. Across Italy, German pilots began whispering a name once spoken as a joke. Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. And from that summer on, they would never laugh at it again. August 1943. The air above Salerno shimmered in the late summer haze, thin, bright and deceptive. The heat distorted the horizon, making distance unreliable and speed impossible to judge. From the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G, Oberleutnant Heinrich Bar scanned the sky for the usual formations, boxy silhouettes of bombers crawling across the sunlight, escorted by the same familiar fighters the Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to defeating. He was 24 years old and already one of Germany's most celebrated aces. By then, he had scored more than 100 victories over the Eastern Front, fighting Soviet aircraft that were rugged but primitive, deadly in numbers but predictable. The Mediterranean, he believed, would be no different. The Americans were new to the game, inexperienced, soft. And the aircraft they brought to Italy looked to the seasoned German eye, clumsy and over-engineered. That morning, reports came from ground control near Naples of a new kind of enemy fighter operating at high altitude. Twin engines, twin tails, no previous identification. Pilots joked about it over the radio. Some said it looked like two aircraft welded together by a drunken engineer. Others called it the twin mistake. Bar had laughed too. To him, speed and agility were the essence of air combat. Two engines meant weight. A split tail meant drag. It was inconceivable that such a machine could challenge the sleek single-engine fighters of the Reich. But as he banked through a high turn over the bay, he saw the flash of sunlight that would change his mind forever. At first, he mistook it for a light bomber. Large, silver, distant. Then, in the span of a few seconds, it was not distant at all. The strange aircraft closed the gap with startling speed, its silhouette resolving into sharp geometry. Two booms extending behind the engines, a central pod for the cockpit and armament. Propellers spinning so fast, the blades were invisible, only the faint shimmer of motion betraying their presence. And on its nose, 4 guns perfectly aligned. No wing convergence, no spread, just pure concentrated firepower. Bar's first instinct was disbelief. American propaganda, he thought, had invented 1,000 miracle planes that never existed. But this one was real, and it was already climbing past him. The Lightning, as the Allies called it, ascended like a machine that ignored gravity itself. Its pilot held a steady climb angle that should have stalled any conventional aircraft. Yet it didn't stall. The twin Allisons pulled evenly, their superchargers whining with mechanical precision. Bar pushed his throttle forward, feeling the G-force press his body into the seat. The Messerschmitt clawed upward, engine straining. The P-38 kept climbing, smooth and effortless. He radioed his wingman to cut in from below. "It's a twin-engine fighter," he said. "Looks heavy. Should be easy prey." The wingman acknowledged and dived toward the Lightning's underside. But the American had already seen him. With a flick of its yoke, the P-38 rolled inverted and snapped into a diving turn so fast that the Luftwaffe pilots were left chasing vapor. In the time it took to adjust their bearings, the Lightning was behind them. The first burst of fire came with terrifying precision, a line of tracers cutting cleanly across the sky, missing by meters only because Bar's reflexes were preternatural. He broke into a dive, pushing the stick forward until his stomach lifted toward his throat. The German fighter screamed downward. Air speed passed 500 kilometers per hour, the control surfaces trembling. When he leveled out, the sky behind him was empty. It was the first time Heinrich Bar had encountered the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and it would haunt him for the rest of his career. In the weeks that followed, reports began flooding in from every Luftwaffe unit operating over Italy and the Mediterranean. Pilots who had once mocked the ungainly twin-tail fighter were now requesting emergency briefings on its tactics and performance. They called it der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. The name began as a joke, then evolved into a warning whispered across radio channels. Achtung! Der Teufel kommt. The devil is coming. The Americans had designed the P-38 for a kind of war the Germans had not imagined possible, a war of reach. Most German fighters were built for European skies, short missions, quick strikes, and immediate returns to base. The Lightning could fly twice as far. It could escort bombers from Tunisia to southern France, from Sicily to Austria, and still have fuel left to fight. For Luftwaffe pilots used to dominance at altitude, the realization came slowly, then all at once. The Americans had built something beyond the usual logic of design, a twin-engine machine that climbed like a falcon and struck like artillery. Bar's second encounter came days later, above the Tyrrhenian Sea. His unit had been dispatched to intercept a formation of B-24 bombers headed toward Rome. As the German fighters closed in, they expected the usual pattern: sluggish escort fighters lagging behind, vulnerable bombers ahead. But this time, the escorts didn't lag. They appeared first, cutting through the haze in tight formation, sun glinting off polished metal. There were 12 of them. P-38 as unmistakable, even at distance. The formation held perfect discipline, spacing measured to the meter. Each aircraft's nose pointed slightly downward, ready to dive. Bar called for a climb. The Germans would attack from above, as they always did. He gained altitude, circling for position, then tipped into a steep dive aimed at the lead Lightning. He expected the usual advantage, the speed of descent, the element of surprise. But before he could fire, the American pilot broke formation, rolled, and met him head-on. The converging fire from those nose-mounted guns filled the sky like a web of light. Bar pulled out just in time, feeling the shockwave of rounds tearing the air around his canopy. He'd been in hundreds of engagements, but never had he seen a pilot react so quickly, so precisely. When he finally looked back, the Lightning was already rejoining its formation as if nothing had happened. He returned to base shaken. Not defeated, not yet, but disturbed. The mechanics asked if his aircraft had been hit. He said no, though his pride had. That evening, in his diary, he wrote, "The Americans have built something extraordinary. It climbs like a rocket, turns with elegance, and shoots with frightening accuracy. It is not beautiful, but it is effective. Perhaps too effective." The Luftwaffe's intelligence division began compiling reports on the P-38's performance. Captured wrecks were examined. Engineers noted the supercharged Allison 541 710 engines, the counter-rotating propellers that eliminated torque roll, and the concentration of all armament in the nose, 4.50 caliber machine guns, and one 20mm cannon capable of shredding a bomber in seconds. It was an engineer's nightmare for maintenance, but a pilot's dream in combat. And it was being produced in numbers that defied German logic. Lockheed's Burbank factory was turning out hundreds every month, each one hand-fitted and tested in California skies before shipment overseas. American pilots called it the twin-engine ace-maker. German pilots called it the plane that should not exist. By late 1943, the Lightning had become a symbol of American persistence. Over Italy, its long-range missions forced the Luftwaffe to adapt or die. German ground crews struggled to maintain aircraft under constant stress. Fuel shortages, spare parts, and attrition were bleeding the force dry. Meanwhile, the P-38s seemed endless, arriving day after day, their silver wings gleaming against the smoke of burning convoys. Heinrich Bar, ever the realist beneath his bravado, began studying the enemy. He requested intelligence briefings, asking for altitude data, climb curves, and engine specifications. He read reports from captured American pilots, men who spoke proudly of the Lightning's ability to fly on one engine, its twin turbos allowing flight at heights beyond the reach of most German interceptors. Baer learned that the aircraft's distinctive shape wasn't aesthetic. It was functional. The twin booms housed the engines and superchargers, allowing the cockpit pod to be streamlined for visibility and reducing drag at high speeds. The result was an aircraft that could dive faster than any fighter in the Mediterranean. He began adjusting his tactics. When lightning formations appeared, he no longer attacked from above. Instead, he used cloud cover, waiting until the Americans began their turns toward home, when fuel loads were lighter but attention wavered. Even then, he found little success. The P-38's high-speed roll rate allowed it to reverse direction in seconds, a maneuver that often left German pilots overshooting their targets and exposed to return fire. The psychological toll began spreading through Luftwaffe squadrons. Pilots who once mocked the Americans now dreaded encountering the twin-tail silhouette. The fork-tailed devil had become a phantom in the clouds, appearing without warning, striking with mechanical precision, then vanishing into altitude. Baer's third encounter came in December 1943 near Anzio. The weather was turbulent. Rolling clouds, heavy moisture, sunlight flickering through gaps. Perfect conditions for ambush. He flew with two other Messerschmitts, their formation loose but alert. Through a break in the cloud, he saw movement below. 3 Lightnings cruising westward toward the coast. He signaled a dive. The German fighters dropped fast, closing the gap. The first Lightning spotted them seconds too late. Baer fired a short burst, rounds striking one engine. The American plane began trailing smoke, but did not fall. Instead, it leveled out, feathered the dead propeller, and kept flying. That should have been impossible. A single-engine fighter hit in one side would spin uncontrollably. The Lightning stayed stable, even turned toward him. Bar pulled back hard, astonished. The wounded aircraft was still fighting. Its wingman rolled in behind him, firing bursts that traced past his right wing. The German ace broke away, climbing into the cloud. When he emerged above it, the sky was empty again. The lightnings were gone. That night, he wrote another line in his journal. "The Americans have built a machine that ignores the rules of physics. It should not fly as it does, but it does. I can no longer laugh at it." By then, German command had issued formal bulletins about the new enemy aircraft. "Avoid head-on engagements," they warned. "Its nose armament is deadly. Attack only from above or the side." Yet even these tactics failed as the P-38s evolved. Newer models had improved climb rates, boosted superchargers, and longer ranges that extended deep into Austria. The Luftwaffe's fuel-starved squadrons were running out of options. Heinrich Bar continued flying, accumulating victories, but the joy of combat was gone. He had become analytical, detached, studying each engagement like an engineer. The more he observed, the more he realized what made the Lightning dangerous was not just its performance, but its consistency. Every American aircraft worked. Every pilot was well trained. Every formation followed the same disciplined pattern. It was industrial warfare in the sky. Production line perfection brought to combat. He once told a fellow pilot, "We fight with skill. They fight with system. Skill fails when the system is perfect." The Mediterranean campaign dragged on through the winter. German forces retreated northward, their airfields bombed daily. The P-38s led many of those raids, their cameras recording targets for daylight bombers, their guns clearing the path for Mustangs and Thunderbolts still to come. The Luftwaffe's intelligence logs from early 1944 show repeated entries. Twin-engine fighter encountered. Impossible climb. Avoid engagement. Bar's respect for the enemy had evolved into reluctant admiration. During one mission near Bologna, he was forced to crash land after engine failure. While awaiting extraction, he watched as a formation of P-38s passed overhead, unchallenged, serene, their propellers glinting in the sun. They did not fire on him. They did not even change course. They were focused on their objective, as if the war below them no longer mattered. He would survive the war, one of the few Luftwaffe aces to do so, with more than 200 victories across multiple fronts. Yet in interviews decades later, when asked which enemy aircraft he most respected, he did not hesitate. "The Lightning," he said. "It was not the most beautiful, but it was the most complete." It represented something larger than war. It showed what happens when engineering serves imagination. Historians who studied Bar's records noted how often his tone shifted after 1943. Before that, his reports were filled with bravado and sarcasm. After the Lightning appeared, they became sober, technical, and sometimes even reverent. The P-38 had forced one of Germany's finest pilots to rethink everything he believed about American aviation. What the Germans never fully grasped was that the P-38 was more than a machine. It was a statement of industrial philosophy, the belief that technology, if applied without compromise, could erase the limits of tradition. Lockheed's engineers, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, had built the aircraft under conditions of near impossibility. They had to design a long-range interceptor that could fight at both sea level and 12,000 meters, fast enough to catch bombers, yet stable enough to escort them. The result defied convention, and that defiance, more than any single design feature, was what unnerved the Luftwaffe. By the time of D-Day, the P-38 had flown in every theater of war. It had served as a fighter, bomber, photo reconnaissance plane, and pathfinder. It had hunted submarines in the Atlantic and Japanese bombers in the Pacific. It was the first American aircraft to shoot down an enemy plane over Germany, and the first to escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Its reach was global, its presence constant. For the Germans who faced it, it became a symbol of inevitability. When Heinrich Bar looked back years later, he described his first encounter with the Lightning not as a battle, but as a revelation. It was like seeing the future, he said. I realized then that we were fighting a nation that could build such things without limit. You cannot win against that. His words would echo through post-war studies of the Luftwaffe collapse. Analysts concluded that the P-38, while not as agile as the Spitfire or as dominant as the Mustang, had achieved something far greater. It had shattered the enemy's confidence. The sight of those twin tails gleaming in the sun became a psychological weapon as potent as any bomb. In the end, the fork-tailed devil did more than outfly its enemies. It outlasted their illusions. The German pilots who had once laughed at it learned a lesson they would carry for life, that underestimating the enemy's imagination was a fatal mistake. And for Heinrich Bar, the ace who mocked the impossible, it was the day he met it face to face. He survived the war, rebuilt his life in a new Germany, and flew again in the post-war Luftwaffe. But he never forgot the summer sky over Italy, the silver flash that climbed past him, and the realization that the world had changed in that single, brilliant moment. The laughter had ended. The respect had begun. August 10th, 1943. Salerno Airfield, Italy. The heat lay over the runways like glass. German ground crews moved slowly between the bunkers as reports came in from the coast of a new American fighter seen over the Bay of Salerno, a twin-engine machine with two tails that climbed like nothing they had ever faced. The men laughed at the description. Two tails meant drag, weight, weakness. It sounded like another Allied experiment doomed to fail. But by the end of that week, the laughter had stopped. At the height of summer, southern Italy had become the testing ground for every new aircraft America could send across the Atlantic. The P-38 Lightning was among them, a plane so unusual that even Allied pilots had questioned its design when it first arrived in North Africa. Twin booms, twin engines, a central cockpit pod that looked more like a bridge than a fuselage. It seemed a contradiction to every principle of fighter design. But to those who flew it, it was a revelation. The first confirmed encounter between Luftwaffe fighters and the Lightning occurred on August 12th off the coast of Palermo. Two Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s from JG-53 intercepted a formation of what they believed to be medium bombers returning from a reconnaissance mission. At a distance, the planes seemed too large and too slow to pose a threat. Then the Germans watched in disbelief as the lead aircraft rolled hard to the left, its two engines screaming in perfect harmony, and climbed vertically into the sun. One of the German pilots, Lieutenant Kurt Wolf, didn't even fire a shot. Radioed back to base simply, "Zwei Schwänze, nicht möglich." Two tails, impossible. Within weeks, the nickname had spread through the Luftwaffe like a rumor of witchcraft. Der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. It was first used as mockery. Pilots joked that Americans had built a fighter for cowards, one engine for each escape direction. But that mockery faded after their first encounter in combat. The devil name stuck, but the tone shifted from derision to fear. The Lightning had been engineered by Lockheed under the direction of Clarence Kelly Johnson, a man who believed that a fighter's job was to rewrite the laws of speed and range. Where most aircraft were designed to fight for minutes, the P-38 was designed to fight for hours across oceans and continents. De Twinton. Allison. To 1710 engines, each carried turbo-superchargers that allowed them to breathe in the thin air at 30,000 feet. Where a single-engine fighter would struggle and stall, the Lightning was still accelerating. German pilots soon learned that traditional tactics failed against it. The Messerschmitt's strength was its climb rate and its tight turn. The Focke-Wulf's advantage was roll rate and firepower. But the Lightning was something different entirely. It could outclimb the Focke-Wulf and outdive the Messerschmitt. Its twin engines acted like muscles pulling in tandem, allowing the pilot to bank and rise in motions that seemed impossible to German eyes. To those watching from below, it looked as if two planes were flying in perfect lockstep. September 2nd, 1943. Over Naples, the Lightning proved its reputation in blood. That morning, a formation of Ju-88 bombers departed for the coastal harbor of Paestum to strike Allied shipping. They never arrived. At 11:20 a.m., 10 P-38s from the 14th Fighter Group intercepted them head-on at 20,000 feet. The German gunners opened fire first, expecting the Americans to break formation. Instead, the Lightning split into pairs and climbed vertically, then rolled over and dived through the bomber stream with all guns concentrated in their noses. The effect was catastrophic. 6 bombers went down in 40 seconds. Radio chatter recorded from the German side carried a single word repeated over and over. Teufel, Teufel, devil. The P-38's nose was a masterstroke of design. Most fighters of the era mounted their guns in the wings, their streams of fire converging at a preset distance. The Lightning placed all its weapons in the nose: 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, each aligned along the aircraft's axis. This meant that from any range, 50 yards or 500, every bullet struck exactly where the pilot aimed. German crews called it the beam of fire. Those who survived described seeing thin white lines reaching toward them, as if the air itself were being torn open. In a war defined by numbers, the P-38's figures told their own story. Top speed, 414 miles per hour. Ceiling, 44,000 feet. Range, 1,300 miles with drop tanks. A German fighter could outturn it at low speed, but few lived long enough to try. Its pilots learned to fight not by dogfighting, but by geometry, using altitude, distance, and timing to dictate the engagement like a mathematician controlling a proof. Those who mastered it became legends. Thomas Lynch, Charles MacDonald, and Robin Olds would each carve their names into the history of the war from behind the controls of the Lightning. For the Luftwaffe, the encounters over Italy and southern France were a study in shock. They had faced fast aircraft before: the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Thunderbolt. But nothing so alien. The P-38 could be at once a bomber, a recon platform, and a fighter. It could escort Allied bombers from North Africa to Austria and back without refueling. Its pilots flew with oxygen masks frosted white from the cold of high altitude, hunting targets that the Luftwaffe thought were beyond reach. By October 1943, German intelligence officers had compiled dossiers on the new plane. Their assessment was half admiration, half resentment. "The Lightning is a heavy fighter of great endurance," one report read. "Its speed and altitude capability make it a serious threat to our bomber forces. It is vulnerable only at low altitudes and in sharp turns. The recommendation: avoid engagement unless numerical superiority is assured." In practice, numerical superiority rarely existed. On the ground, German mechanics collected the wreckage of downed P-38s to study them. They found systems they had never imagined: electric trimmers, hydraulic boosts, redundant controls. Each wing was a labyrinth of cables and piping built with a level of industrial precision that Germany could no longer match under constant bombing. A Rechlin test engineer who examined one Lightning wreck remarked, "This is not an airplane of a nation at war. It is an airplane of a nation of machines." Winter brought new encounters. In January 1944, as the Allies launched the Anzio landings, P-38s provided cover over the coast for hours at a time, fighting off waves of Luftwaffe attacks. They escorted B-17 and B-24s deep into occupied Europe, flying from bases in Corsica and North Africa to targets as far north as Munich. German pilots complained that the devils were everywhere. It wasn't just a nickname anymore. It was an article of faith. Intercepted radio transmissions from Luftwaffe units recorded a new tone of defeat. In February, one distress call ended abruptly with a panicked voice. "Two devils above! Ich kann nicht entkommen. Two devils above. I can't escape." The signal cut out mid-sentence. No wreckage was ever found. For the Americans, the nickname was embraced. Pilots painted small red pitchforks on their noses and twin tails. Squadron crests adopted horned devils grinning over lightning bolts. They understood the psychological value of fear. If the enemy already believed the plane was supernatural, half the battle was won before takeoff. But beneath the myth was a machine of brutal mechanical logic. The P-38 was forgiving, yet unforgiving. Its controls could freeze in compressibility dives, its pilots trained to pull back only after dropping below 25,000 feet. It was a plane that demanded understanding. Those who respected it survived. Those who didn't died quickly. For the Luftwaffe, the toll was measurable. Between late 1943 and mid-1944, German losses in southern Europe rose by 40%. Much of that increase was attributed to the arrival of the Lightning. The plane's ability to escort bombers from Africa to northern Italy and back without refueling meant that no German airfield was safe. Interceptors scrambled to meet the raids found themselves outnumbered and outclimbed. June 1944 brought a new phase of the war. With the invasion of France underway, the fork-tailed devils moved north. Flying out of bases in Corsica and southern France, they swept ahead of the bombers, attacking rail lines, convoys, and communication hubs. To the German troops on the ground, the sight of two contrails merging and diving was the signal to take cover. No one lingered to watch a lightning attack. Even as newer American fighters arrived, the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 remained a symbol of the early Allied advance. It was the aircraft that had crossed oceans, opened fronts, and terrified a generation of German airmen. When asked after the war which enemy plane they feared most, many Luftwaffe veterans answered without hesitation, the twin-tailed American. For some, the fear turned to respect. Oberst Gordon Golob, one of Germany's top aces, admitted in a post-war interview that the P-38 represented the industrial power of America as much as its technological genius. "It was not beautiful," he said. "It was effective." It was built like a factory machine, and it worked. The nickname that had begun as an insult became a testament. The fork-tailed devil was no longer a creature of mockery, but a symbol of a war Germany could no longer win. When the Allies pushed north through Italy, the Lightning followed them. Its reconnaissance variants mapped the Alps, photographed bridges, and tracked retreating columns. Pilots returned with film so detailed that generals could count individual vehicles. The Luftwaffe's days of free movement were over. Every time a German convoy moved by day, a devil was watching. Autumn 1944. The war in Europe was turning irrevocably against Germany. The Luftwaffe was shrinking, its resources strangled, its pilots younger and less experienced. The fork-tailed devil still ruled the high sky. Even as the Americans transitioned to Mustangs, Lightnings continued to strike deep behind the lines, their long range and twin engines ideal for the dying months of the war. In November, a captured German pilot was interrogated by Allied intelligence after being shot down near Marseille. When asked what he thought of the Lightning, he hesitated before answering. "We were told it was slow," he said quietly. "We were told it was heavy. But it climbs like a ghost. You cannot shake it. You dive, it dives. You climb, it follows. The only escape is to pray it runs out of bullets." It seldom did. The stories circulated among Luftwaffe survivors long after the war. The one about the pilot who mistook a pair of P-38s for bombers and was shredded before he could radio a warning. The one about the formation that vanished over the sea after being intercepted by 3 Lightnings. They became part of the mythology of defeat, cautionary tales told in flight schools that no longer had aircraft to fly. In the ruins of post-war Germany, the nickname endured. Der Gabelschwanz Teufel appeared in memoirs, war diaries, and interviews. The same men who had once mocked the design now spoke of it with reverence. It had been their enemy, but also their teacher. It had shown them what industrial war truly meant, not just bravery and tactics, but production, range, and endurance. When Lockheed's engineers reviewed German post-war reports, they were surprised by the depth of analysis. The Germans had recognized what even many Americans hadn't, that the P-38 represented a shift from artistry to engineering in warfare. The Lightning was not a fighter built for elegance. It was a machine built to embody a nation's capacity. As the war ended, its legacy spread beyond Europe. In the Pacific, Lightnings hunted Japanese bombers from New Guinea to the Philippines. It was a P-38 that intercepted and shot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, on April 18, 1943. The same aircraft that had terrified the Luftwaffe had changed the course of the Pacific War. By war's end, over 10,000 P-38s had been built. They flew in every theater, under every condition, and in nearly every major operation. The Germans who had once laughed at the sight of 2 tails had been proven wrong in every possible way. The final irony came from within the Luftwaffe itself. In early 1945, Germany's own engineers began testing twin-boom fighter prototypes inspired by the Lightning's efficiency. None reached production before the collapse, but in their shapes, the twin engines, the central cockpit, the long wings, one could see the ghost of the plane they had feared most. Years later, when surviving Luftwaffe pilots were interviewed for documentaries and memoirs, many still spoke of the P-38 with quiet awe. One veteran summed it up best. "We called it the fork-tailed devil." But it wasn't the devil. It was the future. That future had arrived long before they were ready for it. And so, the name remained, a legend born of disbelief, sharpened by fear, and sealed by defeat. The fork-tailed devil, once a joke whispered in mess halls, became the sound of engines echoing through the sky, the shape of silver wings splitting sunlight, the moment when laughter died and history changed course. For every German pilot who saw it rise through the haze, twin trails carving into the heavens, there was only one thought. The devil was real, and it had come for them. November 14th, 1943. Oberschleißheim Airfield, outside Munich. The morning fog clung low to the hangars, muffling the metallic cough of engines coming to life. Adolf Galland stood beside a line of mechanics, inspecting a captured American fighter that had been towed in during the night. It was large, twin-engined, silver-grey, beneath a film of frost. The man who had once called it a clumsy twin-engine experiment now studied it in silence. The stenciled letters on the fuselage read, P-38 Lightning. For months, reports from Italy and southern France had described a new Allied aircraft defying every expectation. Pilots claimed it climbed like a ghost and dove without mercy. At first, Galland dismissed these accounts as exaggerations, battlefield myths told by nervous men. But this morning, with the Lightning standing before him, its twin tails arching like the prongs of a tuning fork, he could no longer pretend it was a curiosity. It was a weapon, and it was rewriting the rules of air war. Galland's gloved hand rested on the cold aluminum of the fuselage as the chief mechanic briefed him. 2 Allison 1710 engines, Herr General. Turbo-supercharged. Intercoolers mounted here and here. All controls duplicated for reliability. He pointed to the central nacelle, explaining how the pilot could feather either propeller, fly on a single engine, and still return to base. That last detail caught Galland's attention. A German pilot forced to limp home on one engine was often doomed. The Lightning's redundancy was more than clever engineering. It was survival made mechanical. The captured P-38 had been recovered almost intact from a forced landing near Avignon. Its pilot had been captured alive, remarkably uninjured. Galland had ordered the aircraft sent to Rechlin for testing, but he insisted on seeing it first. For the head of the Luftwaffe's fighter command, this was no idle curiosity. Every new Allied design carried implications for strategy, production, and morale. He circled the Lightning slowly, noting the absence of welded seams, the polished rivet work, the abundance of wiring looms. The Germans, now struggling to find enough aluminum for their own Messerschmitts, could not afford such extravagance. The Lightning wasn't merely built to fly, it was built to endure. Back in his office, Galland read through the intelligence summaries stacked on his desk. Reports from Italy, Corsica, and southern France told the same story. P-38 escorts, escorting bombers beyond what had once been considered impossible range. P-38S engaging fighters at 30,000 feet without losing power. P-38S destroying entire bomber intercept units in single sorties. For years, Galland had prided himself on understanding the psychology of aerial combat. He believed that skill, daring, and precision, not numbers, defined victory. But as 1943 turned to 1944, he was forced to confront a truth that no ideology could obscure. The Americans were winning not through better pilots, but through better machines. The Lightning was proof. December 1st, 1943. At Rechlin Test Center, the captured P-38 underwent its first German evaluation flight. Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche, the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilot for enemy aircraft, taxied the Lightning down the frozen runway. Galland watched from the control tower as the engines roared in harmony and the aircraft lifted smoothly into the grey sky. Lurcher's voice came over the radio minutes later. "Climbs faster than expected. Controls are heavy but stable. Lateral balance excellent. Power at altitude remarkable." By the time Lurcher landed an hour later, the verdict was clear. The P-38 was not clumsy. It was formidable. Galland's written notes from that day survive in the Bundesarchiv. The Lightning possesses superior altitude performance. Its range is unprecedented. American industry has achieved a practical combination of power and endurance that our own designs cannot match. He didn't share these conclusions publicly. To the German public, he maintained his role as the confident General der Jagdflieger, the face of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. But privately, he began to worry. Each month brought new losses. Allied bombers were pushing deeper into German airspace, escorted now not just by Mustangs, but by Lightnings that could fly from England to Berlin and back. Galland knew what this meant. Air superiority was shifting irreversibly. December 14th, 1943. Headquarters, Karinhall. Hermann Göring summoned Galland for a strategic briefing. The Reichsmarshal's mood was volatile. Reports of bomber raids on Bremen, Hamburg, and Schweinfurt had shaken even the most optimistic officers. Göring demanded explanations. "Why are our interceptors not stopping them?" he shouted. "We have the best pilots in the world." Galland's answer was measured but firm. "Our pilots are brave, Herr Reichsmarschall, but they face an enemy who can fly farther, climb higher, and fight longer. The Americans have learned to escort their bombers the entire way. They lose few. We lose many." Göring's eyes narrowed. "You mean the new twin-tailed one?" "This? Lightning?" "Yes," Galland replied. "It is no longer an experiment." "It is a serious threat," Göring waved dismissively. "Two engines mean twice the weight, twice the maintenance. It cannot maneuver with a Messerschmitt." Galland hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Perhaps, but it doesn't need to. It kills from above. It fights differently." The room fell silent. In that moment, Galland realized what the Lightning represented. It was not just another opponent. It was a symbol of a new kind of warfare, one defined not by heroics, but by engineering. Throughout the winter of 1943, Galland ordered his intelligence officers to gather every report of encounters with the P-38. They came from every front. Over the Mediterranean, where Lightnings dismantled German supply convoys. Over southern France, where they hunted reconnaissance aircraft. Over Germany itself, where they escorted bombers past the point of no return and still came home on one engine. Pilots described being outflown at altitudes once thought untouchable. The Lightning's superchargers allowed it to climb beyond 35,000 feet, a ceiling where most German fighters struggled to breathe. Its pilots exploited that advantage ruthlessly, diving into attacks with perfect deflection angles. One report described a pair of Lightnings descending on a bomber formation over Augsburg. They came out of the sun, nearly vertical. Our defensive fire was useless. They passed once, and the lead bomber was gone. Galland read these reports late into the night, cigarette smoke curling above the pages. He underlined one phrase from a downed pilot's account. "They have enough fuel to come again and again." That, he knew, was the difference. The Luftwaffe was fighting on fumes, literally and strategically. The Americans were fighting on abundance. January 1944 brought confirmation. Intelligence photos showed P-38s operating from new bases in Corsica, putting southern Germany within their range. Bomber formations that had once needed to turn back near Milan were now flying directly toward Bavaria. German radar tracked the first escorted raids approaching Munich that month. Fighters scrambled to intercept, but few returned. When Galland reviewed the mission data, he saw a pattern that chilled him. The Lightnings were flying farther than any German interceptor could pursue. When damaged, they didn't fall. They limped home on a single engine. Their redundancy turned defeat into survival. He wrote in his journal, "The Americans have designed an aircraft that forgives its pilot. Ours demand perfection. Theirs reward persistence." This is the difference between our industries, our nations, and perhaps our fates. February 1944. In a rare gesture of professional respect, Galland requested that Luftwaffe pilots be briefed on the capabilities of the Lightning. The presentation at Rechlin was quiet, almost secretive. Charts detailed its performance envelope, its engine power, its operational range. Galland addressed the assembled officers personally. "Gentlemen," he said, "the twin-tailed fighter you have heard about is not a myth. It is real. Do not underestimate it. When you see it, do not engage alone. Use teamwork. Avoid climbing duels. Attack from above or disengage." For many of the younger pilots, the warning came too late. By spring, the Lightning was everywhere. Allied units from the 1st, 14th, and 82nd fighter groups roamed across southern Europe, shooting down interceptors, strafing airfields, and cutting off retreating German columns. The Luftwaffe's once proud squadrons were being reduced to fragments. Galland's frustration grew. He had spent his career defending the idea that German skill could overcome material disadvantage. But the Lightning mocked that belief. It was the manifestation of industrial warfare, a machine that turned resources into victory. Its very existence challenged everything the Luftwaffe had once believed about mastery and will. By April 1944, the Allies were preparing for the invasion of France. Galland knew the endgame was coming. He reviewed intelligence photographs showing Lightnings and Mustangs parked wingtip to wingtip across southern England. Thousands of them. The sight was almost surreal. "This," he told a visiting officer, "is what defeat looks like before it happens." The P-38 had evolved by then into multiple variants: long-range escorts, photo reconnaissance platforms, pathfinders, even dive bombers. Each carried the same unmistakable silhouette that had haunted German skies for over a year. In late May, Galland personally inspected photographs of a downed Lightning recovered near Cologne. Its pilot had been killed instantly, but the aircraft had remained largely intact. Engineers dissected its systems and found components marked from factories in California, Michigan, and Ohio. The logistics of it all stunned them. "Each piece comes from a different state," one engineer reported, "and yet it fits together perfectly." Galland understood the implication. The Americans weren't just building planes. They were building an ecosystem of power. June 10th, 1944, 4 days after D-Day. The Lightning's reach extended deep into France. Galland's fighter command, already crippled by fuel shortages, struggled to mount even token resistance. Reports from the field were grim. One squadron after another was wiped from the roster. Pilots now referred to the P-38 not as the fork-tailed devil, but simply as der Schatten, the shadow. It appeared suddenly, struck hard, and vanished into the clouds. That month, Galland wrote a private memorandum for Goering that would never be published. It read, "The enemy now possesses total operational flexibility. Their fighters can accompany bombers from the English Channel to Berlin, from North Africa to Vienna. Our defensive system, designed for regional combat, is obsolete. The Lightning symbolizes that change. It is not the best fighter in any single category. It is the best in all categories combined." The war continued, but Galland's belief in victory did not. He continued to lead, to organize, to fight. But the Lightning had shown him the inevitable. When a machine can cross mountains, oceans, and empires without faltering, no courage can stand against it. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Fuel was rationed to drops. Training schools had closed. Even Galland's own staff officers were flying outdated aircraft patched together from wreckage. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing hundreds of Lightnings each month, each one rolling from factories with engines already tested, guns already harmonized, ready to fly the day it arrived. Galland saw one more Lightning in person before the war ended. March 1945. Allied forces had captured a German airfield near Cologne, and a P-38 from the 367th Fighter Group landed to refuel. Galland, then operating from a nearby command post, was escorted under truce to inspect the site. The American pilot, unaware of his identity, greeted him politely and offered a cigarette. Galland declined, studying the plane's polished skin and simple efficiency. "It is not beautiful," he said to the translator, "but it is perfect." After the war, when Galland was interviewed by Allied intelligence, he was asked which American aircraft he respected most. He smiled faintly before answering, "The P-38. It was our first warning that the tide had turned. A machine that combined range, power, and reliability. We dismissed it as heavy. We learned too late that it could reach anywhere he went, on to explain what few outside the Luftwaffe understood, that the Lightning's greatest weapon was not its guns, but its endurance. It represented a shift in philosophy from momentary superiority to sustained control. The Germans had built fighters for duels. The Americans had built fighters for dominance. In later years, Galland would visit air museums in Europe and America. When shown a restored Lightning at Duxford in the 1960s, he reportedly touched its nose and whispered, "You were the first to teach us humility." The irony of history was complete. The man who once called the Lightning a clumsy experiment had lived long enough to see it remembered as a masterpiece. To this day, aviation historians credit the P-38 as one of the most influential designs of the war, a plane that bridged continents, redefined escort tactics, and forced even its enemies to evolve. For Adolf Galland, its significance was personal. It had shattered his illusions of invincibility and forced him to confront the reality of an industrial war Germany could never win. He had once written that victory belonged to the better pilot. By 1944, he knew it belonged to the better system. The fork-tailed devil, once mocked and dismissed, had done what no amount of propaganda could undo. It had earned the respect of the Reich's greatest fighter commander, not through ideology, but through proof. And in the quiet years after the war, when Galland was asked to sum up what the Lightning represented, his answer was simple. "It was not a devil," he said. "It was an angel of progress, and it showed us how far behind we really were." January 23rd, 1943. Garbes Airfield, Tunisia. The sand was still cool from the night wind, rippled into dunes that reached the edge of the runway, like waves frozen in motion. In the early dawn light, two mechanics crouched beneath the wing of an unfamiliar aircraft. Long, silver, its twin booms glowing faintly under the rising sun. The smell of oil and dust mingled with the hum of its idling engines. The plane was American, newly arrived, and unlike anything the Allied ground crews had ever seen. On its nose, someone had stenciled a name in black paint. Lightning. At that moment, no one at Garbes could have known that this strange machine would soon transform the entire air war in the Mediterranean. Within weeks, its pilots would be flying farther, faster, and deadlier than any Allied fighter before them. The Germans would give it a name whispered across radio channels: Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. But to the men who flew it, it was simply the Lightning War. The North African campaign had entered its final and most desperate phase. Rommel's Africa Corps was retreating westward across Tunisia, pursued by British and American forces closing from every direction. Yet even in defeat, the Luftwaffe still dominated the skies. Its Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs ranged freely over the desert, striking convoys, strafing columns, and hounding bombers before they could reach their targets. Allied pilots, flying shorter-ranged single-engine fighters like the P-40 and Spitfire, could only watch as the enemy slipped beyond their fuel limits. The arrival of the P-38 changed everything. Unlike any fighter before it, the Lightning could cross entire countries on a single mission. With its twin Allison engines and massive fuel capacity, it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, then fight its way home. Its designers had built it not just for speed, but for endurance. The turbo-superchargers allowed it to climb above 30,000 feet, even in the blistering desert heat, where thin air had crippled every other aircraft. Its first missions were cautious. Pilots tested range, fuel use, and tactics over the barren expanse between Libya and Tunisia. But by February, the Lightning was striking German targets at will. Convoys moving west from Tripoli began to vanish beneath waves of precision attacks. Railway lines, depots, and airfields, once safe behind the front, were reduced to twisted metal. German reports described high-altitude fighters diving out of the sun, always in pairs, always striking without warning. The Lightning's nose-mounted guns turned its attack runs into something like artillery fire from the air. Every bullet converged on a single point, turning trucks and fuel tanks into fireballs. To the men on the ground, it seemed that death itself had learned to fly. March 5th, 1943. At a German supply depot near Garbes, Oberfeldwebel Karl Hoffmann was repairing a half-track when he heard a sound unlike any he had heard before. A deep, synchronized roar, smoother than the shriek of single-engine fighters. He looked up just in time to see two glints of silver descending from the clouds. They came almost vertically, their engines howling in unison. The first burst hit the fuel drums. The second passed straight through the maintenance shed. The entire depot erupted in flame. "They didn't even turn," Hoffmann wrote later. "They came once, then vanished. No plane could do that distance twice. But they did. It was the birth of a legend, the fighters that never turned back." By April, Allied commanders had realized what they possessed. The P-38's range made it the only fighter capable of escorting heavy bombers across the Mediterranean. Missions that had once been suicide became routine. From bases in North Africa, Lightnings could reach Sicily, Naples, and even southern France. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy that could chase it home. The Lightning's twin engines gave it another advantage few appreciated at first: safety. In desert warfare, every mechanical failure was deadly. One seized piston, one oil leak, and a single-engine plane became a coffin over the dunes. But a P-38 could lose half its power and still fly hundreds of miles back to base. Pilots began returning from missions with one propeller feathered, their planes limping in on a single roaring engine. Each successful return was more than a rescue. It was proof that technology could outlast chance. As Rommel's forces collapsed in May 1943, the Luftwaffe withdrew northward to Sicily and mainland Italy. The Lightning followed. The Mediterranean had become a chessboard of range and endurance, and the P-38 was the only piece that could cross it in a single move. In June, Allied intelligence noted a pattern in German communications, increasing references to Zwillingsjäger, twin fighters, appearing in unexpected sectors. These weren't rumors, they were warnings. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. At dawn, a formation of over 300 C-47 transports carrying paratroopers crossed the Mediterranean under cover of darkness. Above them, the first wave of P-38s from the 82nd and 1st Fighter Groups flew escort. Their silhouettes caught the first light of sunrise over the sea. Below, the invasion fleet stretched from horizon to horizon, the greatest armada the world had ever seen. When German bombers rose from Catania to intercept, the Lightnings were waiting. Their first attack shredded the formation before it could reach the coastline. Allied observers on ships watched streaks of flame fall into the sea. The sky looked like it was being unzipped, one naval officer wrote. The Lightning's role in the Mediterranean was unlike any fighter before it. It was not simply to protect, it was to dominate. Within weeks of the Sicily landings, the Luftwaffe's transport routes across the straits were destroyed. Every daylight crossing risked annihilation. Even the once feared Italian Macchi fighters could not match the P-38's climb or range. To maintain morale, German propaganda called it the American twin mistake, claiming the design was untouchable and prone to failure. But the pilots knew better. They had seen their comrades vanish beneath its guns. By August, the term Lightning War had entered Allied slang. It described not a campaign of bombing or invasion, but the sudden shift in air power that followed the P-38's arrival. Luftwaffe diaries from that summer reveal the growing despair. One entry from JG-27, stationed near Naples, reads, "The twin-tailed fighters appear every morning. They dive, shoot, and climb away before we can react. Even when we damage them, they do not fall. They turn for home and come back the next day." That endurance carried psychological weight. In every war, perception becomes reality. The Germans had believed that distance and fuel would protect them. The Lightning erased that belief. September 1943. The Italian armistice shattered Axis defenses in the Mediterranean. As German forces rushed to occupy their former allies' airfields, P-38s struck first. The 1st Fighter Group attacked Foggia, strafing rows of parked Ju-88s and Mi-110s. The results were devastating. Within a single afternoon, the Luftwaffe lost 50 aircraft on the ground. For the first time, Allied pilots reported entire targets devoid of resistance. The Luftwaffe simply wasn't there. Its supply lines had been cut, its fuel convoys destroyed, its morale broken. The P-38s now operated almost with impunity. From newly captured Italian bases, they could reach as far north as Austria. Their reconnaissance versions photographed every bridge, road, and factory from Milan to Vienna. Each sortie added to the sense that the war had turned. For years, the Luftwaffe had dictated when and where battles would be fought. Now it reacted, always a step behind, always out of range. The German High Command recognized the danger. In October, Luftwaffe II issued new directives. Avoid pursuit of twin-engine enemy fighters beyond coastal limits. Prioritize defense of industrial targets. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Control of the Mediterranean skies had been lost. Through the winter of 1943 and into early 1944, the Lightning continued to carve its legend. Its pilots flew missions across storm-lashed seas, through lightning and flak, escorting bombers to targets like Rome, Anzio, and Cassino. Every successful sortie widened the gap between Allied capability and Axis endurance. The Lightning's pilots developed a bond with their machines that bordered on reverence. They called them sleds, angels, and sometimes simply our twins. Many named their planes after hometowns or sweethearts. The nose art became a gallery of American optimism painted over steel. Miss Virginia, California Cutie, the Flying Dutchman. To their enemies, these painted machines represented something almost supernatural, an industrial spirit given form. German intelligence reports began including behavioral analysis. Enemy twin-engine fighters display unusual persistence, likely long-range escort doctrine. Morale of own pilots declining in southern sector. The phrase "fighters that never turn back" entered official use that spring. It was no longer hyperbole. P-38s were flying 12-hour missions across 3 countries, landing with tanks nearly dry, their pilots exhausted but alive. Even Rommel, in his private correspondence, acknowledged their impact. In a letter dated December 1943, he wrote, "The Americans have achieved what we once thought impossible, complete tactical air superiority. Their twin-engine fighters patrol as if the sky belongs to them. They see everything, strike anywhere, and vanish before we can lift a finger." By the time Allied forces invaded Italy, the Luftwaffe's role in the Mediterranean was symbolic at best. Its remaining aircraft were scattered, its supply chain severed, its crews running on fuel reserves measured in days. The Lightning had made traditional interception obsolete. In April 1944, one of the last organized Luftwaffe formations in Italy attempted to intercept a bomber raid near Verona. 20 W-19s climbed into the path of 300 American bombers escorted by Lightnings. The result was a massacre. Only 7 German fighters returned to base. Their commander's final radio transmission was terse. "The twin-tailed ones are everywhere." That battle marked the effective end of German air power south of the Alps. When Allied historians later analyzed the campaign, they identified the Lightning as the single most transformative aircraft in the Mediterranean theater. It had not only destroyed targets, but rewired strategy. By providing bombers with long-range escort and reconnaissance, it allowed Allied planners to move from island hopping to continental invasion. But for the men who fought beneath its wings, the Lightning's power was measured not in charts or strategy, but in emotion. Fear for one side, confidence for the other. In the words of one Luftwaffe survivor, interviewed decades later, "The Lightning broke our spirit before the Mustang broke our backs." Its psychological effect was immense. German radar operators began reporting phantom lightnings, blips that vanished, echoes caused by nerves and sleeplessness. Convoy commanders rerouted at night, convinced they were being watched. Aircrew superstition took hold. Some refused to take off when the morning sky was clear, calling it lightning weather. To Allied intelligence officers, this fear was as valuable as any bombing run. The myth of invincibility worked both ways. For every German who believed the lightning could not be stopped, an Allied pilot believed it could not fail. By mid-1944, the Mediterranean had become an Allied lake. Fuel depots burned along the Italian coast. Rail lines lay twisted in the sun. In their place, the contrails of lightnings stretched from horizon to horizon, thin white signatures of dominance. The war would soon move north into France and Germany, but the pattern had been set. The lessons learned over the Mediterranean would define the rest of the conflict: range, coordination, and relentless pressure. The Luftwaffe would never again control the tempo of battle. Years later, when veterans gathered to speak of those days, they described the Mediterranean not as a campaign, but as a turning point, the place where the tide of air power shifted from defense to offense. A British observer stationed in Malta wrote in his diary, "We knew the war was changing the day the twin tails came." The Germans used to own the sky. Now they borrowed it, and only for minutes at a time. Even in post-war German memoirs, the same refrain appears: they never turned back. It was not just the endurance of the machine, but what it represented. The idea that technology, when coupled with will and production, could erase geography itself. In that sense, the Mediterranean Lightning War was not a battle of aircraft, but of philosophies. The Germans fought to preserve mastery through tradition and skill. The Americans fought to replace mastery with capacity, the ability to project power anywhere, at any time, indefinitely. The Lightning embodied that vision. It flew from continents, crossed seas, and outlasted its own reputation. When the final victory came, few remembered the dusty runways of North Africa or the bombed roads of Sicily. But historians would later trace the moment of transformation to those early months of 1943, when the first twin-tailed fighters rose from the desert and refused to turn back. From that moment on, the Luftwaffe's war was no longer about winning. It was about surviving. August 17th, 1943. Dawn over the English countryside. The air smelled faintly of dew and cordite, the residue of yesterday's training sorties still lingering on the grass. At Station 131, Alconbury, crews of the 55th Fighter Group moved quietly around their aircraft, tightening bolts, checking ammunition, feeling the tension of history before it happened. The mission brief had been delivered hours earlier: escort duty for the largest daylight raid ever attempted against the German Reich. The target was Regensburg, the Messerschmitt factory itself. In the grey light, the P-38 Lightnings looked almost alien among the rows of heavy bombers. Their twin tails caught the rising sun like silver pitchforks, their propellers idling in perfect rhythm. Ground crews called them angels. Bomber crews called them salvation. But to the Luftwaffe, still confident in its own superiority, they were a curiosity, an ungainly twin-engine experiment that could never match the agility of a single-seat German fighter. That assumption would not survive the day. At 800 hours, the first wave of B-17s lifted into the morning haze. Behind them, the Lightnings climbed in formation, their pilots settling into the steady hum of dual engines. The air above the channel was calm, the sky clear, perfect flying weather, and perfect for killing. Across the continent, at bases near Augsburg and Regensburg, the Luftwaffe was already waiting. German radar had picked up the bomber stream crossing the Dutch coast, and fighter units were scrambling to intercept. Dozens of Bf-10-9s and F-19-0SS roared off their runways, climbing toward 30,000 feet, where they expected to meet lumbering bombers crawling toward Bavaria. Among the German formations that morning was Jagdgeschwader 26, a unit of seasoned aces. Many of them had fought in the Battle of Britain, in Russia, and over North Africa. They had faced every Allied aircraft: the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the P-40, the B-24, and believed none could match their speed or climb rate above 20,000 feet. Their briefings told them the same. The new American twin-engine fighter, the P-38, was fast only in a dive and hopeless at altitude. At 9:40, those beliefs began to die. Somewhere near Frankfurt, a formation of lightnings appeared ahead of the bombers, silver shapes rising out of thin air. The German pilots were stunned. The Americans had climbed higher than expected, far higher than any twin-engine fighter should. One pilot, Lieutenant Franz Becker, later wrote, "We expected them below the bombers, lagging behind. Instead, they were already above us, turning to meet our attack." The P-38's superchargers had done their work. At 30,000 feet, its twin Allisons still produced full power, while the German DB-605 engines were already gasping in the thin air. The result was a reversal of physics itself. The hunters had become the hunted. The first attack came from a pair of lightnings diving from the sun. Their nose-mounted guns, 4.50 calibers, and one 20mm cannon, fired in a single, concentrated stream. There was no convergence zone to calculate, no wing-mounted sword. Every bullet struck the same point. The lead 109 disintegrated instantly, its engine exploding in a burst of white flame. Down below, bomber crews watched in disbelief as their escorts tore through the interceptors like sharks among smaller fish. One gunner on a B-17 from the 100th Bomb Group recalled later, "We saw them go right past us, silver streaks, then black dots falling behind. We didn't know the P-38 could move like that. Nobody did." The battle over Regensburg was chaos made visible. 30 minutes of continuous engagement across 10,000 feet of altitude, with lightning slashing through formations, rolling inverted, diving into clouds, climbing back out to rejoin. Their pilots had trained for this exact environment. Long-range combat at altitude. Formation, discipline under stress. Each flight of 4 moved as a single organism, maintaining spacing so tight it looked choreographed. On the ground below, the factories of Regensburg burned, the B-17s, flying straight and steady through flak and smoke, dropped their loads with deadly precision. It was one of the few raids that struck exactly what it had intended, the beating heart of Germany's fighter production. But the real shock of the day came not from the bombers, but from the lightnings that escorted them. Luftwaffe controllers at Würzburg and Munich intercepted frantic radio calls. "Achtung! Zwillingsjäger at altitude! They are faster than expected." Another voice shouted, "Cannot climb with them! They are above us!" The tone was disbelief, not panic, as if the pilots were witnessing a law of nature being rewritten. For the first time in the war, German command acknowledged that an American fighter could outperform theirs at height. By 11 o'clock, the battle had spread across half of southern Germany. The lightnings, running low on fuel, began turning southwest toward bases in North Africa, following the mission's daring shuttle plan. Unlike the Mustangs and Thunderbolts that would later dominate Europe, the P-38 could make the journey. 1,600 miles from England to North Africa, striking the Reich in one direction and landing safely beyond reach of interception. The Germans had no comparable capability. When the surviving Messerschmitts returned to base that afternoon, the hangars at Regensburg were gone, the factories reduced to blackened rubble, and the runways littered with wreckage. Luftwaffe losses exceeded 60 fighters, many destroyed not by bombers, but by the very escorts they had dismissed. That evening, at the Regensburg sector command post, the surviving officers filed their reports. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, but the message was unmistakable. The enemy twin-engine fighter exhibits superior climb rate at high altitude. Its armament is formidable. Recommend revised interception tactics. In Berlin, the news reached General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland. He read the dispatches in silence. Only weeks earlier, he had seen a captured Lightning at Oberschleißheim and noted its endurance. Now, the field reports confirmed what he had suspected. The P-38 was not a curiosity. It was a weapon of dominance. The Regensburg raid had achieved far more than industrial damage. It had changed perception. Until that day, the Luftwaffe had treated American fighters as a secondary threat, escorts for vulnerable bombers, easy prey for well-trained aces. The Lightning shattered that illusion. It could climb, it could strike, and most importantly, it could survive. Pilots who had once laughed at its ungainly shape now spoke of it with reluctant admiration. One ace, interviewed after the war, admitted, "We thought the twin tail meant it was slow." But when I tried to follow one in a dive, I could not. It simply left me. The psychological blow was immense. For a decade, German doctrine had rested on the belief that technical superiority, engines, aerodynamics, precision, would offset numerical inferiority. But over Regensburg, those assumptions burned away. The Americans had caught up, and in some ways, surpassed them. In the weeks following the raid, Allied intelligence intercepted Luftwaffe training revisions that explicitly referenced the Lightning. New pilot manuals warned, "Do not engage the twin-tailed American fighter at high altitude. Its firepower and climb are exceptional. Break contact by dive only." It was a small paragraph buried in the technical notes, but it marked a turning point in doctrine. For the men who flew the mission, the cost was steep. The 55th Fighter Group lost several Lightnings to flak and fuel exhaustion, their long journey ending in forced landings across the Mediterranean. Yet even in loss, the message was clear. The P-38 could reach anywhere and return. In the days that followed, Allied newspapers called it the Regensburg Shuttle. Pilots called it something else. Proof. Proof that the Lightning's endurance and firepower could rewrite the geography of war. German intelligence quickly began studying the aircraft more seriously. Engineers at Rechlin requested additional captured examples for testing. They wanted to understand how two engines could maintain synchronization without vibration, how the counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque, how the superchargers functioned at such height. The findings were alarming. A report dated September 1943 summarized, "The P-38 is not an experimental design. It is a mature weapon. Its performance at altitude is superior to the Bf-109G in both climb and speed. Its stability in dive is exceptional. Caution is advised." That final phrase, "caution is advised," was an understatement born of denial. For the Luftwaffe's high command, the implications were existential. The Lightning's success at Regensburg proved that no point in Germany was beyond Allied reach. Its long-range escort capability meant that the Reich's industrial heartland, once shielded by geography, was now exposed. Factories that had survived years of war through sheer distance now faced destruction from above, and the skies themselves had become corridors of inevitability. By October, Galland ordered a full reassessment of interception tactics. Fighter wings were restructured for layered defense, radar coordination expanded, and new aircraft, the Mi-410, the Tu-152, were rushed into development. None could change the truth that had unfolded that August morning. The Lightning had rewritten the rules of engagement. Over the following months, Luftwaffe pilots began encountering Lightnings across the entire European theater. Over the Alps, the Adriatic, even the Balkans. Their presence became a warning sign that the Allies were near, a prelude to bombing raids that no longer required mercy of distance. One German intelligence officer later recalled, "After Regensburg, whenever we saw twin tails in the distance, we knew the bombers were not far behind." It was like seeing the future and realizing it was not ours. As winter approached, the Regensburg mission took on near-mythic status among Allied crews. Veterans told the story to new arrivals in the mess halls of England and Italy, how the Lightnings had led the bombers across half of Europe, fought the Luftwaffe head-on, and still found the fuel to reach North Africa. It was the moment, they said, when the twin tail became a symbol rather than an experiment. Even the Luftwaffe's top tacticians could not ignore the outcome. In late 1943, Galland personally noted that the P-38 had demonstrated unexpectedly high performance at operational ceiling. For a man who once dismissed it as a clumsy twin-engine mistake, the admission was extraordinary. The pilots who faced it remembered something else. The sound, the deep, synchronized hum of twin Allisons approaching from altitude, like thunder rolling in perfect harmony. One veteran from JG-53 later said, "You could hear them before you saw them." Two engines in balance, not uneven like our twins. It was a sound that meant the bombers would reach their target. And they did. The Regensburg raid crippled production at Messerschmitt's primary plant, delaying aircraft deliveries for months. Replacement parts became scarce. The Luftwaffe's own fighter output dropped precisely when it needed to rise. But beyond statistics and wreckage, the raid had a subtler consequence. It forced respect. The Germans had learned something vital about their new opponent, that the Americans were no longer experimenting. Their fighters were not crude copies or mass-produced mediocrities. They were refined instruments of strategy. When post-war historians interviewed surviving Luftwaffe officers, they all cited the same moment of realization. It was not D-Day, not the Mustang, not the bomber streams over Berlin. It was Regensburg. Major Wolfgang Später, a test pilot and tactician, put it simply, "We saw then that the Americans had surpassed us, not just in numbers, but in thinking." The Lightning was proof. From that day onward, the Luftwaffe treated the P-38 not as a curiosity, but as a priority target. Pilots were briefed on its strengths and weaknesses. They learned that its engines were vulnerable in tight turns, that its radiators could overheat, that its size made it visible from afar. Yet despite every tactical countermeasure, one fact remained: the Lightning's ability to fight where others could not. As the war dragged on, the lessons of Regensburg echoed across every sky in Europe. The Luftwaffe adjusted, the Americans improved, and the twin tail continued its relentless march from skepticism to to supremacy. In time, even Galland would look back on that day as the true turning point of the air war. "It was when we stopped laughing," he said. For the men who flew the Lightning, that was all the validation they needed. The P-38 had not just escorted bombers. It had escorted an idea that engineering, endurance, and coordination could outlast arrogance. On August 17, 1943, over Regensburg, the Luftwaffe learned that lesson at 30,000 feet. And from that height, there was no turning back.